actually a very beautiful one, but they were hard to obtain. I looked at this from the U.S. citizenship, the USCIS. This is one that I was teaching citizenship preparation for the citizenship exam at the Learning Center for a few years until the state cut the funding. But anyway, you know, this is the one they got. It's very good. I got one from the Heritage Foundation, you know, which you can imagine is going to be. That's another one from Close Up. Did you just get that now?
No, I got it.
Oh, it was on the desk?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. That one's mine. You can have it till we leave. Kind of have to give that one back. I can give you another one, but the pages doesn't matter. The words are the same. So the Heritage Foundation, they have their own agenda. That's a conservative one. This one I got from the ACLU at a thing. This one's really interesting in that there's no Declaration of Independence. There's no table of contents, and there's no commentary about when they were ratified or anything like that. And so it is the stripped down version, you know, just the actual words of the Constitution. And I like to point this out, that this is the entire, all the words of the Constitution of the United States. And this particular version has bigger writing than the ones that you have. It is the shortest Constitution in the world, right? Which means that it means that it doesn't cover everything in detail. There is, as we may see when we go in the original articles, there is something called the Necessary and Proper Clause, saying that Congress has a right to pass any laws that are necessary and proper for the good running of the country.
But they're not working these days.
Sometimes that's referred to, if you're teaching American history, as the Elastic Clause, because it stretches to cover everything, right? So some people see that as a virtue, that it's pretty short on detail, and other people see that as a problem. Because what happens when there's a conflict of interest, right? And in the 1920s, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, for part of it, at the beginning it was William Howard Taft, and then later on in the 20s it was Charles Evans Hughes, who you might have heard of. He was a progressive governor in New York. He ran against Woodrow Wilson in 1916, lost an election incredibly narrowly. Probably the closest election, except for the one that was stolen from Gore, but the closest election in American history other than that poor Bush one. And so he was a pretty famous character in his day, Charles Evans Hughes, maybe forgotten now. But he was Chief Justice in the late 1920s, and I think that phrase, the only thing I can quote from him directly is, he said that the Constitution is what the Supreme Court says it is, right? And so that's a really interesting phrase, because in fact that has come to be true, right? So when we look at this, we'll see, you know, there's oh, let me tell you what's in the little packet of stuff that I gave you. I should tell you that. The first page is my handwritten stuff. Could you? Yes. Is my handwritten thoughts about what I was going to say in the beginning. Annie has said to me that, I should type this out. It's not that I couldn't type. I don't have a printer at home, but I teach part-time at 2 schools, so I could print it out. But I find that this is writing as I'm thinking. And I like to do that on the first page. Okay, the introductory stuff. Then there are 3 other pages in here that are not my handwritten. One is the Declaration of Independence, which isn't directly our topic, but is really important to understand. This is just the first part of it, the part that most people are familiar with. It goes on for pages. There's a whole bunch of stuff that we'll talk about that Jefferson writes, attacks on the King of England very specifically. Then there's this introductory page. And at the Adult Learning Center where we're teaching, somebody left and I started to take over somebody's course in January, and I was looking around to see what was available materials. And I found this book. It was Constitution Made Easier. And it was kind of like putting the the language into more colloquial language, something that we would speak today. And so this introduction came out of there, that thing. And then on the last page, I have sort of the schematic for the U.S. Constitution, which came out of that book, right? And it just shows you the articles, 7 original articles, and then there are 20, when I looked at the book, it showed 26 amendments. So I looked in the front and it was printed in 1987, and of course the 27th Amendment is not till 1992. So that's why it's handwritten in here, the 27th Amendment. And then I wrote some other stuff on here, which I'll probably be reading along with you. But I just wanted to show you what was there. I thought about this, obviously, for a while, because it was planned about a month ago. And I was thinking, well, we can read the Constitution, page by page, and that would be, it's brutal, actually, particularly the original articles. I can point out a couple of them. The way someone wrote, and the way Jefferson is the chief actual puts pen to paper writer of the Declaration, the wording, right? The actual wording, who wrote it, is James Madison, right? Somewhat forgotten president, an actual really important guy in early American history. He's not on any kind of money, and so he's sort of forgotten about that. I mean, it's just, people don't even, one of the things I was doing when I was teaching the citizenship classes and all the people, is showing people money, putting it on a big projector, right? Who's this guy on the 10, you know? Who's the guy on the 20? And what are they there for, kind of thing? And on your coins, and then of course it's really interesting to look at our quarters over the years. And I showed them Susie B's and Sacagawea coins. But anyway, it was interesting. I like that. People don't even look, I mean, they don't look at their change much anymore. I look at all my change, but they don't even on the bills. It's just like they all look the same except for the number on the top. It's a, what's that?
They're getting ready to get a new bill.
Well, there has been that Harriet Tubman talk for forever.
I ain't thinking about Harriet Tubman.
And I don't, know what else we'll get, because there's been that question about Jackson, who, anyway, I could do a big thing on Jackson, but anyway, for good and bad. So, the introductory part here, before we get to the actual Constitution. The Constitution goes into effect, becomes the law of the land on March 4th, 1789, in New York City, right, which was, Philadelphia was the capital of the Articles government, and then when they're going to have the Constitution government, it's in Lower Manhattan, right? My wife and I went there the year before last. We went to see the 9/11 memorial, but you just walk up the street and essentially right across the square from the New York Stock Exchange is Federal Hall. And there's a big statue of George Washington in front of it, and that's where George Washington is inaugurated as president. They had already decided to move the capital to Washington, D.C. Compromise, one of the things that Hamilton offered to get southern states to ratify the Constitution. And we'll talk about that more. That's why we have a Bill of Rights, to sort of bribe local states or individual states to ratify the Constitution. But one of the things Hamilton offered as a deal is to move the capital out of the north to the middle, so to speak. And since the country is Maine to Georgia, middle is sort of D.C. And of course it was called the District of Columbia, not Washington. It's called Washington after Washington dies, to honor him. Washington, District of Columbia. It's actually Christopher Columbus, right? Columbia. That's that's what it is. And so that's where the current government of the United States, under this Constitution, begins March 4th, 1789. It was interesting when I was looking at this, and we know, although none of us was alive at this time, that the presidents got inaugurated on March 4th until 1937, when Roosevelt is the first one to have it on January 20th, right? So it's always January 20th, unless that falls on a Sunday. So, so that remained it, but Washington isn't actually inaugurated until April 30th of that. So I knew that that was the fact, but I didn't really look up why until recently, and I always thought because Washington was sick or something, but that wasn't the case. On March 4th, they didn't reach a quorum. That is, they didn't have enough members of Congress to show up to count the electoral votes, right? So they had to wait until enough people showed up to count the electoral votes to name Washington as the president, right? There was no doubt. There was no one running against him in that first election in 1788. So, but that's the reason why, if you read somewhere, he was not inaugurated till April 30th, when we think it should be March 4th. That was the reason that I found looking it up.
Why did they move Election Day off of the election?
Ah, yeah, I mean, that's in one of the constitutional amendments, which are so interesting to read, much more than the actual articles, which are really stumble things. But it was called the Lame Duck Amendment in 1933. Hoover, okay, the country had descended into the Great Depression, and Herbert Hoover was the president, one-term president. He took over in 1928. The fall was utterly precipitous. When Hoover was elected in November of 1928, he was considered to be kind of the perfect American man. This is because you think of Hoover now very negatively, but when he got elected in 1928, he was like a heroic figure for a number of reasons.
They put the water in Las Vegas.
Well, yeah, Hoover Dam, but that was no, Hoover Dam was not him. It was put in by the Roosevelt administration. They named it after him in honor, right? But anyway, Hoover had been born into absolute poverty. He was orphaned as a little child, was sent to, in Iowa, and his presidential library is in Iowa. He was sent to live with relatives in Oregon, was a scholarship boy, got a scholarship to Stanford. He worked, the kind of kid who worked in the kitchen in the morning, you know, to serve people who are coming in, that sort of thing. And then he became a mining engineer, became a self-made man, got himself super wealthy. During World War I, he was in charge of relief in Europe, feeding starving people, and actually even brought food to Russia when it had collapsed under the Bolsheviks in the beginning, before they were told to leave by the harder communists when they take over in 1923. But he's considered an American hero. He should have been the Republican nominee in 1920. It was Harding, but it should have been him. But the conservative elements in the Republican Party didn't want Hoover because he was a progressive. So you can see, just in an 8-year period, now we think of Hoover as being like a rock-ribbed conservative and couldn't respond to the times, etc. And that's like all true. So when he gets elected in 28, like about 8 years too late, he's at the end of the Roaring 20s. He takes over, he makes these speeches about the economy being like a cornucopia, and there's endless wealth coming out and all this sort of thing. Just a little bit later, it crashes. And it turns out that he's not, that his biggest problem is that he's not a supple thinker. He believes what he believes and is upset that the world doesn't conform to what he believes. So we know him as a person who literally, we think of him as a person who froze in the face of the Great Depression. And by the end, he really was. He was sitting in the White House in sort of a puddle of despair. This is his secretary has a diary that writes about just how he just gave up. Yeah.
How did that crash develop?
Oh, it's a bigger thing. But you know, there's the stock market crash and it's overinvestment. And it's overinvestment. They were producing more than the ability of people to buy. And the workers who might buy things are not getting paid enough to buy. And people have invested in a stock market bubble. It crashes. And when the stock market crashes here, people start pulling in their loans, which were in Europe. And so Europe actually crashes, the dead crash before the United States. But the problem is our real trading partner at that time is Europe. They buy nothing and everything crashes. And so everything in the United States, warehouses just full of goods, are going on sale. People have to lay off their workers. They're not making any new anything. It's a really big thing. So the government would have to be extremely creative. It isn't true, I'm getting a lecture on Herbert Hoover here, it isn't true that he didn't do anything. In the beginning, there are big projects of building the dam, which he begins, that eventually is Hoover Dam and, you know, Lake Mead and that sort of thing. He begins that. They have some large building projects, but he doesn't believe, because his own life story about pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps,
Yes.
he doesn't believe in giving direct assistance to anybody. That would erode their moral character or something like that. Obviously, Roosevelt comes in with a totally different thing. So to answer your question here, Roosevelt gets elected in November, like the 4th or 5th of November of 1932, but he doesn't become president until March 4th. This is months and months and months of a economy that is in absolute free fall. I show pictures to the history books that I have to the immigrants that come in, there's these long lines, the bread lines, the soup lines, and that sort of thing, saying this is the United States in the 1930s. I mean, you may have seen this on television in Sudan or something, but this was happening, and there's this long period of lame duck with a guy as president, but he's not doing anything, so they decided to shorten up the period. Right? It was originally put at March 4th because in the beginning you have to get to the capital on your horse, and January 20th much of the country is, you know, bad weather, so they you know, put it March 4th after sort of the worst of the weather was over, right? But January 20th they move it to there, and you know, you've seen some inaugurations that have had, well, this last one, right? Trump had it indoors because it was cold. Kennedy's inauguration, have you seen the pictures? You know, he wanted to project vigor, so he's not wearing an overcoat on an extremely cold day, right? And it's interesting. William Henry Harrison, in 1841, right? He wants to project strength. He's an older fella. A general, and he's very famous, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, that sort of business, and as an Indian fighter on the frontier, and he doesn't wear the overcoat, and he gives what is considered to be the longest presidential address. He catches pneumonia or something, and he dies within 40 days. So he's the shortest serving president there. Anyway, so which brings me, I'm really fascinated by vice presidents. If we do some of these things again next year, this is like from October on of next year, you know, I think in terms of school years, because I'm a teacher, so next year is after September. But a thing on the vice presidents of the United States is just fantastic. I mean, some of them become president, and sometimes that's a disaster because they're like Lincoln and Johnson. They're just simply not on the same page. But the reasons why they're picked, you know, by the presidents mostly that ticket balancing thing is just a fascinating study. I took a course at BC years ago in the 80s, and it was American presidency, but the woman who was teaching it, her specialty was American vice president, so we spent a lot of time talking, and it was just, pretty much if you've been a history teacher for years, you know about the presidents, but the vice presidents are really pretty interesting in their obscurity, but they weren't obscure at the time that they were there. So anyway, before the Constitution, I started here in 1763, right? So, things don't emerge out of nothing. There has to be a basic cause for things to take place, right? I used to teach for 35 years, modern European history. So where does that begin? The AP guidelines would say, oh, do the Renaissance to the fall of the, to the end of the Cold War, right? But where do you begin? To begin any place. And I used to begin at the waning of the Middle Ages, like some event that really turns the page in history. And for modern European history, so to speak, modern is ideas, not technology. For modern European history, it's the Black Death, right? Which everybody's heard of, Black Plague, that sort of thing. But between 1347 and 1351, 4-year period, 35 to 40% of the people of Europe die, just die. They get sick, they're dead in a couple days. No one knows why, because they don't know anything about microscopic organisms, right? And they're just dying all over the place. Don't know why. They don't even know how it's transmitted. It's particularly deadly because it's transmitted both by breathing, but also by touching. So it is, if you go to take care of your sick mother, you die too. And it's just extraordinary. Now, what's interesting about it is there are two essential questions in history, I think, right? Why do people believe what they believe? And why do things change? Those are like the two essential questions in history. And of course, they're kind of inextricably bound. And so you look at this, with this tremendous disaster, do people continue to believe what they believed all the time? The belief was everything is the will of God. Really? This is the will of God? Why, if that's the case? So that was that sort of thing. And change. It's interesting, we think in market terms. So we think that if the labor, a third of your labor disappears, what happens to wages? It goes up, right? I mean, we think of market terms. They didn't, but that kind of idea grabs hold. The peasants start demanding higher wages. And of course, like everywhere in history, the power structure doesn't give up their power without, great violence. So, it takes a long time for that to sink in, but this is like an essential change point. So I'm thinking about where to go to talk about the Constitution, right? So this is the 250th anniversary, right, of the American Revolution, April 1775. We just had the hoopla in Lexington and Concord, right? The Constitution is written in 1787 and not adopted until enough states ratified by 1788, but it doesn't start till. So there's even that period of time. What's happening in between there, right? And so, we take a look at that. But what initiates the revolution that causes the Constitution to come into existence, right? And a key date in history, and in European history it was a key date. In 1763, Treaty of Paris, which ends the 7 Years' War, right? 7 Years' War. It's considered by historians the First World War. Literally fought on every continent except for Antarctica, which was not seen by any Europeans till 1820, right? So this is a world war, and what is it about? Control of colonies, right? Control of colonies. And it's the chief combatants are the British and the French. It's fought all over the world, right? Before the 7 Years' War, from the period of American colonization, the 13 colonies, until 1763, historians refer to this as a period of benign neglect. The British government didn't actually intervene, almost not at all, in the American colonies, right? Besides buying things that the colonists would produce. The biggest thing that the colonists had, you might not think about this, was wood, right? In the British Isles, they have pretty much denuded their forests by this time, and the British Navy rules the world. Their boats are made out of wood, you know. And what the Americans have, the most valuable thing they have is wood. Also, there's the fur trade and all that sort of business, but they have wood, right? So that's a big deal. The Americans do not have manufacturing. And so by the 1700s, the British were manufacturing things. And so it's a pretty benign trade, but they don't try to intervene. It's not because the British are enlightened about this, it's that British history is so in turmoil, right, during the period of like the 1600s and the 1700s that they can't intervene, right? So if you look, for example, the British are really latecomers to colonization, right? The Spanish, you know, Columbus is in the Caribbean 1490s, right? And the Portuguese are in Brazil by early 1500s, Pizarro and Cortez conquers Mexico in 1520. But the first British colonies in, you know, the 13 colonies, you have Jamestown in 1607 and of course Plymouth in 1620, and Mass Bay Colony in 1630, right? So that's a whole century that they're behind on this. There must be a reason, right? It's not like they don't know that there's a new world. Actually, a British explorer, John Cabot, got to Newfoundland in 1497, so it's not like the British didn't know that the place was there, right? So they're having all this turmoil. We were just watching recently this Mirror in the Light about King Henry VIII's court and everything. But the British government is constantly in turmoil. During the Tudors, it's a mess, right? They don't have any offspring. So when Queen Elizabeth dies, right, she has no heirs, and there are no Tudor heirs left. And so the King of Scotland comes down and is now the English king. He's a foreigner. Because Henry VIII's father married off his daughter to the King of Scotland. So now you got the Stuart kings here who are not Englishmen. And their idea of rule is quite a bit different than what the English think they're going to have. Anyway, yeah. And so anyway, and then during the Stuarts, there's the English Civil War, right? And so the colonists who come to Massachusetts are escaping persecution, religious persecution. The Mass Bay Colony is Puritans. The Pilgrims are different people. They're separatists, but they're escaping the way things are in England, right? So they're not going to have not a lot of colonization during that period. There's a giant revolution, the Glorious Revolution in 1789. This is sort of important for the American Revolution. William and Mary. Mary is the daughter of the king. She marries William of Orange, right, who's the chief noble in the Netherlands. They come over, defeat her father, and William and Mary. But to be accepted, they give all sorts of concessions to Parliament. There is a Bill of Rights, and there, you know, a lot of stuff that's copied by the Americans. Thomas Jefferson's, one of the people that he reads most deeply is a guy named John Locke, 2 treatises on government, and a lot of the Declaration of Independence, the wording is picked from John Locke, right? So now you think, well, things are okay now because William and Mary, they've sort of stabilized things, but they die without heir, and the sister, Anne, who's the last Stuart, she dies without heirs. Now this seemed like really strange. That was the big problem Henry VIII had, but of course, childbirth was a really fraught experience then. Not easy today, but, and so lots of people. Thomas Jefferson's wife had 14 pregnancies, 4 live children, that made it to teenage years. So this is pretty common, right? The funny thing is, that's the end of the Stuarts. Who becomes, since they don't have any, I'm really getting to 1763 here. They don't have any living relatives. So one of the things that happened in the Glorious Revolution, since a lot of the fighting was about religion, was that they agreed to something called the Act of Settlement, which says that no Catholic can become king or queen of England forever. And it's still actually a law today, right? So when Anne dies, the closest living relative, who's not a Catholic, is the Elector of Hanover, George, the first Elector of Hanover. All right, so he's a German guy, comes over, doesn't speak English, comes over, takes his big stipend that he's getting for being King of England, and goes back to Hanover, which is sort of a poor area of Germany. He's happy as a clam. So is the English Parliament. That king's not doing anything. We're running the place, right? So you have this going on for a while, and then George II, his son, participates a little bit more. George III, the bad king that's denounced by Jefferson 27 times, right? That guy becomes king in 1760 during the course of the 7 Years' War. Now, 7 Years' War in the United States, what do we call the 7 Years' War? What? The French and Indian War, right? Cool. It's the French and the Indians, with the exception of the Iroquois, against the English, right? And that exception was really big. But this is the battle that's going on. And what's the piece of literature that we know about this is how we know about the French and Indian War? The Mohicans, yeah. Just wonderful. Just a wonderful book. I had to read it in college, and I'm thinking, this is archaic language or something, but you're surprised. What a great story. And if you don't have time to read it, I do endorse the most recent movie, the one with Daniel Day-Lewis. Quite good. Anyway, but that's a turning point in North America, right? And so the British win, and they kicked the French out of North America. The British also in that war kicked the French out of India. Now the British have North America and India, which later becomes the jewel in the crown, but these are both extraordinary sources of wealth if they're extracted from properly. So the battle, this international war, the taxation on the British people was horrendous. There are rioting against the taxation that is funding this war. The king is saying, we got to win this war. Too bad, we'll worry about things later. When it ends, it occurs to George that the cash cow that they haven't yet milked is the American colonies, right? So, you hear all Stamp Act and all these various taxes that they put on them, and the tea tax and the Boston Tea Party, and all of that sort of thing, right? And it escalates. The Americans have ruled themselves for over a century now. All of a sudden, the British are sending troops to enforce the laws. They're closing ports, like they closed Boston, and George back over here is arguing, not having ever been to the United States and never does, is arguing that we just saved you from the French and the Indians, right? And now we're going to, you should pay for this. It sounds like Trump and Ukraine, right? The kind of thing you should pay for the defense, that we're providing you. And so there is some analogy there. All right. Also, George's government does some other things that really tick off the colonists. The native peoples, the Indians, are a real problem. They're not happy, and as more Europeans come encroaching on their land, there's, constant fighting, right? All the way out to, Custer's last stand sort of thing. I mean, it's constant fighting going on. So the British government has an idea, which looks good on paper. Draw a line up and down the Appalachian Mountains, tell the Indians to cross over to what's called the Proclamation Line of 1763, tell the Indians to move on the other side, and the colonists, the British colonists, are not allowed to cross. Ha! They are really angry, because that had been French territory. Now it's open to settlement. And the king, way back somewhere, right? And of course, in those days, because you're on the boat, you know, this is a long time to get there. It's not like hopping on a plane to London. It's far away. And he's telling them this. And so they're really angry. Plus, it was a Quebec Act. At the end of the war, all of a sudden, the British are ruling a ton of French people up in Quebec. What do you do about their rights? So to kind of quell any possible uprisings, they assign a lot of rights and self-determination to the Quebecois, that we would call today, right? Much better rights than the 13 colonies people have, and they're angry about that. These people are the enemy. Didn't we just fight them in the war? And now they're having better rights than we have. So this, in 1763, it starts boiling up, right? And so you have this constant back and forth, Boston Massacre, 1770, right? And so it just continues to escalate. If you read diaries from British gentlemen, traders, generals, governors, the governors are appointed at this point by the king, they talk about the arrogance of Americans. How these people think they're better than everybody else. It is true, and this is absolutely true figure. On a per capita basis, right, the American colonists in the mid-70s, even at the time of the Salem witch trials, on a per capita basis, are the richest people on earth. Now, it's not equal, but it's more equal spreading of wealth because people can own their individual farms. That's the point of emigrating to the New World, right? You go out in the wilderness and you cut out your own farm and that's yours, right? And so everybody has these opportunities that don't exist anywhere else in the world. And they are just ripe for taxation. You know, it's like Willie Sutton, why do you rob banks? That's where the money is. And so that's the way the British see it. You know, that's where the money is, the colonies. So this is going to be no taxation without representation, etc. And so you have this period of time. So if you're looking here, I've got 1760, George III needs to, cover the war, 1763, the Proclamation Line. So the Americans begin this thing you've heard of, committees of correspondence. Literally send letters back and forth, right? This idea of the Postal Service, which has never, ever been endangered until first Trump presidency, and now this privatization thing, one of the glories of the United States, even in colonial times when it wasn't yet that, was the postal system. Just an extraordinarily, better than any place in the world by quite a margin, right? And so they're passing these letters back and forth. What are you going to do? People from far away, Virginians and Massachusetts, New York and the Carolinas, what are we going to do about this, right? Finally, they decide that they're going to meet as a group, those who are concerned, and this is the First Continental Congress. It meets September 5th, 1774. 12 states show up. This is in Carpenter's Hall, not Independence Hall, not the one that you go to as a tourist, right? That one is for declaration and for the Constitution, but the First Continental Congress, I've never been to Carpenter's Hall. I always thought it was in the same place, but I looked this up and it was in this other place. 12 states show up, but not Georgia. You might say, is that interesting? Kind of is, right? Why doesn't Georgia show up? They're actually fighting a war, uprising of the Native Americans at that time with the help of British troops. So they're not going to go up to Philadelphia and say, oh, screw the British troops, because they're being helped at that time. So, you know, it's like, I'm a little bit nuts, but I look at that and I think, now why wouldn't they show up, right? And so I looked this up, and that turns out to be the reason. I thought that was cool. Anyway, Carpenter's Hall, they're gonna talk about organizing resistance to the coercive acts. Now, the taxation by George, it's not really analogous, but it reminds me of Trump's tariffs on and off and changing the policy on a weekly basis, maybe daily basis. The change in the tax, there would be some uprising, so they would remove one tax and they put in another tax and all this sort of thing. And they pass in Congress the Parliament, called the Coercive Acts, where they declare their right to use military force to enforce any taxes that they do on the Americans, and that the Americans are in rebellion, treasonous against the empire, if they resist. So this is just like, sorry guys, you have no rights anymore, kind of act of Congress, and that's what they're going to talk. How do we respond to this? This is the ultimate slapping down insult, right? So they meet, right, in Philadelphia. This is, so September 1774 is before Lexington and Concord, right? And they agree, the leaders, by the way, were Adams, Washington, and John Jay, who was the first Attorney General eventually when that happens, and he's sort of a big figure. He was from New York. He's one of the writers of the Federalist Papers. There's a John Jay College, which is a police training kind of place, or anyway, in New York now. So he was a fairly big figure, somewhat forgotten, right? And it's at this that they use that phrase, no taxation without representation. And they also, as an economic weapon, agree to a non-importation of British goods. They're not buying any British goods, right? So they're, they're wealthier than the people on the continent, on average, and they are just a great market for British goods. This is during the first industrial revolution, so they've already had the steam engine, James Watt, and all this sort of thing. And so they're pounding out manufactured goods in Britain, and one of the places to sell it. And so non-importation of British goods. We're not buying any of your stuff, right? And they agree to reconvene on May 10th of 1775. When they reconvene, the battles at Lexington and Concord have already taken place, and so they're in open rebellion. So the question is, what do we do next, all right? And they spend a lot of time talking, right? One of the things they do is on June 14th, George Washington is made the commander of the American forces, such as they were. It's interesting where he takes over as the commander of the forces. Do you know where the actual physical place was? No, it's Cambridge Common. If you go up, like right across from Harvard's, walls, and you walk over to Cambridge, there is a monument there where he becomes the commander and is made commander or whatever, given his papers or whatever on them. So that's in 1775. There's still a long time before the Declaration of Independence. The Americans are sending what are called olive branch petitions to the British, offering deals, try this, try that kind of thing. But the British Crown has decided that they're going to make a point, that they're not backing down on this. You are subjects, you have to act like subjects. You can't act like an independent entity and still say you're subjects, So they're gonna, so this is, now you've got two irresistible forces going on here. So they continue to the peace proposal, but by July of 1776, the Declaration of Independence. Now, the Second Continental Congress also has some other duties besides writing the Declaration of Independence. and I got them listed there. Number 2, send delegates for allies in Europe. The allies are Spain and France, right? Enemies of the British. So the Americans, famously, Benjamin Franklin goes to the court in Paris and charms the heck out of them, right? And he wears the coonskin hat and he pretends to be kind of a charming yokel and all this sort of thing to get the French to do this. The French make a serious financial mistake putting big, I was going to say bucks, francs, into supporting the Americans during this war, without which the Americans would not have won the war, right? I mean, absolutely essential that they did this. We've been watching this PBS series, Marie Antoinette, and so it's Louis the 16th, the one who executed there. But he doesn't have any money, and he had agreed when he was a very young teenager, didn't know what he was doing. He's convinced to send loads of money to the Americans. Why? To get back at the British because they're our enemies. No real advantage to the French except that screw the British and have them lose their their most wealthy colony. And that happens, but it doesn't help the French any. So you do have that, but that does take place. The Spanish, it's interesting, around the margins, the Spanish in like Florida, New Orleans, places like this, are somewhat helpful to the Americans. Funny, I went to some conference and I got a book it's for kids in California, I guess, and it's some pages, it's about the Spanish helping the Americans during the American Revolution. One page is in Spanish and one page is in English, so the kids can read both. Anyway, I still have it. I don't have anybody to give it to. It's like, I'm sure you all have books, right? You know how books are like everywhere. Somebody will take your books when you love that, and anyway.
I can give you back your book.
No, I'm talking about the big fat books that you have at home, and you're trying to give them away for someone so your kids don't have to dispose of them when you go. But anyway, all right. Let's see, what else did they do? They had to come up with a name for the country. I know that sounds like, really? Well, how hard could that be? But they debate this quite a bit, and they come up with the United States of America. That's done by the Second Continental Congress before there's any, Constitution or Articles of Confederation there. And they do agree to set up a government, and it's the Articles of Confederation is the first government, right? And so on November 15, 1777, the Articles are the first, the war's still going on, the first government of the United States, till March 4th, 1789, right? So, which is when the Constitution takes effect. So we do have this Articles of Confederation. If you were in American history class, the typical question that you'd have to answer at some point was write an essay saying about the weaknesses of the Articles and its accomplishments. It does have accomplishments in setting up a system for settling the West, and the West is considered on the other side of the Appalachians. So it is and you talk about the land ordinances and the Northwest Ordinance, for example, which forever prohibited slavery in the, in the 5 states that are, from Ohio to Michigan. Anyway, those sort of things. So it does have, but largely it's a failure, right? And the features of the Articles, which is on my page here. Weak central government. It's described as a league of friendship. The colonies see themselves as independent entities, independent of each other, right? And so they're going to I'm trying to find an analogy. It's even weaker than the European Union, all right? Where there's a lot of contention about which rules apply to where, and there's a lot of complaints in further away, the smaller European Union countries, that they're making bureaucratic rules in Brussels, and don't they know about us, that kind of thing. This is even worse than that, right? And state sovereignty. Each state is virtually its own little country, right? So the Congress is in Philadelphia, the Articles of Confederation. Limited powers of Congress. They have the power to declare war, to make treaties, and manage foreign affairs, right? But they lack the power to tax, to regulate commerce, or to enforce laws. And so it's like, we have a government that really doesn't function. One of the most notable things when I explain this to like high school kids is, if you took a load of goods from New Bedford and you were going to go to Providence, you would pass a border in which you could be charged a tariff for moving goods across a border. Plus, each state can make their own money, right? So these are things that, you know, are not going to lead to a strong country. So, you know, we'll get to that. There's no executive or judicial branch. There's only the Congress. So the powers that would be exhibited by or held by an executive or judicial branch are done by states, state courts, state government, right? And of course there can be conflicts there. Amendments only with unanimous consent. So right now, if we pass an amendment, it's hard to do. It's 3/4 of the state legislatures after 2/3 of both houses of Congress. Here, all states had to agree. So you're not going to get anything done, really. There's no national currency, no national draft of soldiers, and they can't raise funds to pay for the soldiers. And so this is just like, theoretically we have a government, but in fact but the war is going on, you know, and the war is fought just like much of the Civil War by local militias that sort of sign up to be part of the National Army, right? So you have the Maine boys go down and fight at Gettysburg or something like that. Tennessee volunteers, like the sports teams, that sort of thing. Anyway, and no national court to settle disputes between states. Right. So, delegates from 5 states meet in Annapolis after the war is over, in Annapolis, Maryland. The Annapolis Convention. This is the brainchild of Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton is the chief mover, I think, of the Constitution. Right? Hamilton's vision is that this country, with endless wealth, should become sometime in the future the greatest country on earth, because it has the wherewithal to do so. But what you need is a constitution that is designed for a country that eventually will be greater. You know, and these people are envisioning immigration. They know that immigration, they're thinking primarily immigration from Europe, but you know, not all the Europeans are the same. Lincoln, for example, has been last summer at a course reading a lot about Lincoln, and he was a great advocate for bringing in immigrants, right, from Europe in the 1840s and 50s, this sort of thing. And you know, a German or a Norwegian seems very, very different than somebody who's Scots-Irish or something like. So these people do seem like real foreigners. It's not just like they're all the same because they're white guys. So anyway, there's all these opportunities, but we sort of have to unite together in order to. So states have to give up certain authorities. They have to agree to a central government, right? So they meet in Annapolis, only 5 states, major states around there, Virginia, New York, New Jersey, I think Massachusetts, Maryland maybe. And they meet and they decide to have a larger convention in May of 1787 in Philadelphia. This is the one that writes the Constitution. 115 days, Constitution Day, September 17th, 1787. If you're a high school teacher every year in September, something comes from the Board of Ed or from, history program saying, this is Constitution Day, and try to talk it up with your kids, right? Nobody knows. One of the questions of the citizenship exam is, what year is the Constitution written? Who knows? Right? Everybody knows the 4th of July, 1776, because we have fireworks. But, September 17th, it's like, we're back to school, Labor Day's over, everybody's back to work, nobody pays attention to that, right? So if you're a good history teacher, you say, oh, today's Constitution Day, and then you give them a little lecture about September 17th, 1787, but it isn't a biggie, all right, as you know. It takes 9 states, 3/4 of the state legislatures, so that would be 9 states at that time out of 13, to ratify the Constitution. It's done by June 21st, 1788. Now they got to sort of like just get offices and stuff. So they're moving from Philadelphia up to New York, and they finally get it together, and they set the date for the beginning of the new Constitution, March 4th, 1789, right? By the way, so the place where the Constitution is written and the Declaration of Independence, you may have visited that as a tourist. It's a national park site. When it's open, you can walk in for free. You can see, they'll say, oh, and here's where Washington sat, and that sort of thing. So, or Jefferson or whatever. It's pretty cool. Philadelphia was the state capital at that time. So, of course, I'm thinking the other day, really? Isn't Harrisburg the state capital? Harrisburg became the state capital in 1812, just in case you're wondering. There is sort of move, when you look at a map of the United States and where they put state capitals, sometimes it's not really obvious. Like New York City is not the capital of New York. Trenton is the capital of New Jersey. Trenton, you ever been there? That sort of thing, really kind of obscure places. And, why isn't Burlington the capital and not, or Manchester the capital and not Concord? So you have this sort of thing, but if you look at the older capitals, they're on rivers. So you keep that in mind, they're on rivers, and they're also, where they can, in the center part of states, more toward the center so that people can get there, because it was harder to get to places, on foot or on your horse. And they're on rivers because river transportation precedes 1812. There's no railroads or anything. So they put in Harrisburg, and that's an example. Boston doesn't move. It's not Springfield, which is on the river, but in a lot of places. Augusta, Maine, right? It's not Portland, which was always a bigger city. Augusta's in the middle, but it's on the big river, right? Cool capital to visit if you ever get a chance. They have a wonderful state museum, just wonderful state museum. And also Harrisburg has a wonderful state museum that's free if it's open when you go there. Anyway, so Federal Hall, New York City. And it doesn't last that long, right? 1800, the White House is built. Thomas Jefferson is the first president to be president in Washington, D.C. The White House that we have now is not even part of the original one. In the War of 1812, famously the British, after failing to take Fort McHenry, right, so Star Spangled Banner, they do go to Washington and burn the Capitol to the ground. They burn down the White House, right? This is in response. In the War of 1812, the American troops went up to York, which is now Toronto and was the capital, and burnt down their provincial Parliament House. So this is the burning of Washington was a revenge for the burning of the Canadian, they called it Western Canada. It was Ontario now, and they burned it down there. So anyway, next page, Declaration of Independence. Both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States are built based on the philosophical principles of the Enlightenment, right? The people who were at these two events were the educated elite, of the United States. These people had studied, and what do we call it, the Senate? Well, they had studied Rome, right? And these people knew about classical literature, you know, and it's a republic, the Roman Republic, right? And so, you know, there aren't republics in Europe. This is the sole republic in the world at the time. And they've read the Enlightenment, which has been going on in Europe since the 1600s, a new way of thinking. Why do people believe what they believe? And there's a new way of thinking. So I said that I had taught European history for 35 years, and you're teaching AP, and you got all this, and the test's going to be on May 10th, and you started like the week after Labor Day. How are you going to do hundreds and hundreds of years and big things? So you have to give it to kids in like digestible chunks that they're going to remember. So when I got to the Enlightenment, I wanted to find a single document that would tell them what the beliefs of the Enlightenment were. And I didn't pick a European author. I picked this. So this is the philosophy of the Enlightenment. Right, so Jefferson starts, this is such a polite document. Jefferson's, as my wife knows, one of my favorites, right? Extremely polite man. Would not talk in public. You know that the Constitution requires, it's written in there, that the President give a State of the Union address. They don't use that, but they report to the Congress annually on how the country's doing. Right? I forget the exact wording here. So Washington gave 2, John Adams gave 1 before the Congress. When it was Jefferson's turn, he sent his secretary up to read his thing. He did not speak in public. He'd have other people read his stuff. He didn't like to talk aloud. He was concerned about his weak speaking voice and this sort of business. He was sort of extremely shy in dealing with big groups of people. Although, by all accounts, and after he's president, people come from all around the world, well, that's mostly Europe, to come and visit him, make appointments to have like tea or dinner with him in Monticello. So he starts by saying, okay, look, here's why we're doing this. This is a unique thing, this kind of revolution, right? And he's going to explain why. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume amongst the powers of the earth a separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to this separation. Right in this first one, there's this laws of nature and nature's God, right? Is Jefferson religious in the sense like, if you're Catholic, you go to Mass on Sunday, go up and get the communion, in the old days you might have gotten a confession. No, right? Jefferson and many, probably a majority of the writers of the Constitution are deists, right? They don't deny the existence of God, right? But God is not an interventionist God. You don't pray to God, you know, do the sign of the cross before you come to the plate, and maybe God will help you get a single, you know, that sort of thing. They don't believe that you can pray to God and have intervention. The vision of the Enlightenment is what one guy called the watchmaker God. You wind it up, God makes the perfect universe, winds it up, and lets it go, right? So that's a start. But what about us? Right? What do we have? And the belief of the Enlightenment is that we are given by God, as part of the natural order of things, the ability to solve our own problems. This is the gift, right? And it's not given to us individually, it's given to us sort of collectively as part of this perfect universe that God creates, right? Which means that men can rule themselves, right? Rational. So, you have, just the wonderful stuff here about holding these truths to be self-evident. What did they talk about at the meeting, right? Jefferson doesn't write this on his own. Jefferson, you read about his diary, he's really frustrated. He wants to put something in, but the committee that's there is telling him, no, you can't put that in, and that sort of thing. He's really frustrated. They make him take things out. They say, oh, put these words in, but it is said that the self-evident is given to him by Benjamin Franklin, right? Anyway, who's there? Franklin's an old guy. He's in his 80s, and so I don't know how legendary this is, but in the old days, people really respected elderly people because they were around for a long time and they knew a bunch of stuff. Now, you can't get the clicker to work, and so the young people think you're dumb, and it's like, oh, what about the things that you know? Anyway, so Franklin is both at the Declaration, and the Constitution, which is unusual. Jefferson is not at the Constitutional Convention. Jefferson is the ambassador to France at that time. And so anyway, there is this committee. But the last sentences, the last words are written by Jefferson. That they're endowed by their Creator, again, not a personified God, the almighty something, nature's God that created what we see everywhere, with certain unalienable rights, right? Unalienable rights from which you cannot be separated. The word alien, unalienable, is like the word alien, right? From the Latin alia, meaning the others, right? And we're saying you can't other people, right? We have that phrase now they'll talk about, right? Not like us, right? These are unalienable rights from which you cannot be separated, right? And amongst these, so it's not exclusive, are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and to secure these rights. Why do we have government? Governments are instituted among deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, right? That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of those ends, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish it and institute a new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. The government is for us, made by us, not to serve the government or its officials, right? And then he talks about prudence. You shouldn't be changing these things so quickly. And, you can read this here. Now, also in your book, there is, after that opening statement, Jefferson begins attacking the king in specific, right? The Parliament is actually passing these things. But if you want to make it, it's the person of the king. This would be, I think, on page 36, right? Page 36, the top left. It says, to prove this, he's going to say how we're being abused. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. And then it says, he, 27 times.
Wow.
Jefferson goes after the person of George, right? He, because they're trying to personify the evil. If you say like the Parliament, then some guys in Parliament weren't for anything. You want to really focus your attention on where the problems are. So he has 27. Amongst the ones that was removed by the committee was Jefferson's condemnation of the slave trade, which he denounces quite specifically as human rights violations. Jefferson, I think the last time I talked about abolition, in the original Constitution has a law in it that says that no law can be passed to limit the slave trade until 1808. Right, so this is passed in 1788. So they're basically giving the slavers a big chunk of time to import as many slaves as you can during that time. Get the rush in, right? And so in 1808, actually 1807, the Congress does with Jefferson. He's the president with Jefferson's push to end the slave trade. Now people say, well, did Jefferson have slaves? Yeah, he did. Okay. And so I'm not trying to justify that at all. But Jefferson's vision was a nation of small farmers, yeoman farmers, people that farm their own thing. And so he didn't see slavery. He thought it would stop the slave trade. Maybe it would go away. Right? He wasn't big on confrontations, which is another thing. He's frustrated privately that they make him take things out and change the wording, but he's not one to go after people personally, right? Which makes him a figure of admiration, but there's also complaints, particularly in his second term, that he doesn't do enough to address problems. But anyway, that's a Jefferson study. So anyway, you can look at this and there's tons of that, all right? So then, after the Declaration of Independence, you have this introduction page here, and it says, our country won its freedom in 1781, right? 1781 is the Battle of Yorktown, and it's at a peninsula. I am sad to say that I have never been there. One of my goals is to have a little trip, car trip. It's not that far to Virginia. And on the Yorktown Peninsula is also Jamestown, the first settlement, and also the House of Burgesses and William and Mary in Williamsburg, colonial Williamsburg. I haven't been there. People have been there. I want to try to go when it's not like crowded, like school vacation week. I hear it's very crowded. And then in the summer it's brutal hot. So I don't know, maybe October, when I'm not working at all sometime.
There's no bad time to go to Williamsburg.
Is that right?
None.
It's
Okay, thank
nice.
you.
It's very nice down there.
Yeah, there's plenty of trees. You can go in and out of the houses.
Yeah.
And it's like it was for them.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I just hear wonderful things
A
about it.
history teacher that hasn't been to
Okay, I'm
Williamsburg
sorry.
blows my mind.
Give him a hard time. Come on, Steve.
I'm sorry about that. I mean, if I've been everywhere, then I got nowhere to go, so.
Should we pass a hat or something?
No, no.
My gosh.
Anyway, it is talk, but there's also, it's like, what about all the other places? So eventually I'll get there, right? It's not as hard to get to as, say, Japan. So I'd rather get to Japan while I'm not too old.
Have you been to Pearl Harbor?
No, I'm going to Hawaii too in the next 2 years. Japan and Hawaii, the next 2 years. Our goals, not this year, next year and the year after. I know.
Nothing will move you like Pearl Harbor, but a history teacher.
She's been to Worcester.
Give him a hard
Okay.
time. Come on.
Okay, I have been to Tokyo and I've been to Moscow, so that's it. Anyway, so here we go. The nation's leaders were afraid that the new country would fail. They called together leaders from all the states to work on the problem. Amongst them are Washington, Jefferson, James Madison. The meetings for the Constitution begin in May of 1787. Oh, why I wanted to mention the 1781. The Battle of Yorktown is 1781. The Treaty of Paris, which ends the war, is 1783. The Battle of Yorktown is won. It's in October of 1781. The British are caught. Cornwallis's army is caught. You know, and if you've been there, you probably heard the ranger say this, but they're caught on the peninsula without being able to be resupplied. And the Americans are able to basically block them off. The reason that they can't be resupplied is that the French naval commander, Admiral de Grasse, decided to come out of the French colonies in the Caribbean with his fleet to cut off the British supplies. The British are totally surprised because generally the fleets would not come out of the Caribbean in October because hurricane season. Why you don't take cruises to St. Kitts or something in October. I've never been on a cruise either. So anyway, but I just want to point that out. It's 1781, but it takes them 2 years to, and it's Treaty of Paris. It's where the British concede, right? The British never really concede, by the way, American independence, which is why you have the Second War, right? The War of 1812 to 1815, right? And it's the Treaty of Ghent, which ends that actually the British really do accept American independence, right? And the Americans also disavow their attempts to take Canada. Trump isn't the first American to think about taking Canada. There were American invasions of Canada during the American Revolution and also during the War of 1812, right? Including, like I said, burning down their Capitol building, right? The Americans had thought, foolishly as it turns out, that they would have a willing audience of compatriots in Quebec against the British. But the reason the Quebecois do not want to be part of the United States is because of the intense religious prejudice against Catholics in the colonies, well, the new America, right? Only Maryland is the only state that accepts Catholicism as a legal religion, right? Everywhere else, they have to be in hiding and stuff. So plus, as I said, under the Quebec Act, they had a lot of freedoms given to them by the British government that the Americans really didn't have either. But the Americans thought that would be easy pickings because they would have the help, but that didn't happen. So anyway, Articles of Confederation, the states had a lot of power, we talked about that. So, the writers of the Constitution knew that the government with too much power can take away people's rights. To prevent this, they created the separation of powers. Right? And so, this can be eroded, and that's one of the complaints that's happening now. The separation of powers can be eroded. Right? If you look at the Constitution itself, and you don't have to say, but if you look at the last page where it talks about the order of them, right? Article 1 is the legislature. It creates the legislature of the United States. Two-house legislature, and a lot of the stuff that we know about the power of the purse, taxing and spending originates in the House of Representatives, then it has to be passed by the Senate, right? And then it goes to the president. But the first article, and I don't think it's accidental, they're thinking about, we're going to create a government. What are we going to do first? We're going to build a legislature, right? So that goes first. Second one is the executive branch, right? The executive branch is second, right? And it talks about the president, vice president, powers of the president, all that sort of duties, everything. Impeachment, it does talk about the impeachment, right? That federal officials can be removed by acts of Congress. The impeachment proceedings begin in the House of Representatives, and then there's a trial at the Senate, right? And so, we know that on the attempted impeachment of, the impeachment of Trump twice. Impeachment just means charges are brought. The trial takes place with and it says this in the Constitution, with the Chief Justice as the presiding officer, takes place in the Senate, right? And you have to have 2/3 of the senators vote to remove the president, right? Never has happened, right? Andrew Johnson was impeached, won by 1 vote. Bill Clinton was impeached, won pretty overwhelmingly. And Trump was impeached twice. And, getting 2/3 of the Senate to agree to anything, particularly when it's controlled by the president's party, is not going to happen. So impeachment has taken place 4 times. There's never been a conviction and removal of a president, right? All federal officials can be impeached. Jefferson, right in the beginning, when they were just trying things out, tried to impeach a Supreme Court justice that was appointed by his predecessor, John Adams. Samuel Chase didn't get away with it. The Congress saw it as overreach of presidential authority, and Chase won almost every vote. Right, so it didn't happen, and no. Some federal judges or appointed have been impeached here and there. I can't name one right now. In recent years, one in Florida and one in New Jersey in the last 10 years or something. But no Supreme Court justice has ever been impeached. Right. Okay. So then the judicial branch. It's interesting that the judicial branch is not really defined. In Article 3, it says that the Congress, the legislative branch will set up a court system. Right, so in the beginning, it just says there will be a Supreme Court, but it doesn't have anything else. And it's left to the legislative branch to create a federal judiciary. So there's the Judiciary Act of 1789 that creates the judiciary, and then there's another one, 1798, that makes the Justice Department, and the Attorney General creates a Justice Department. So this is almost like an afterthought. It's like what they thought of first, second, third, in order. Then there's relations of state to each other. That's a big, big issue, right? So this is, you coin, everybody has the same money. Nobody can charge tariffs to each other. And there's also the Full Faith and Credit Act clause and the, there's two of these. I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank right now. But that say that rights that you have as a citizen of Massachusetts also apply to a citizen of New Hampshire, right? So if New Hampshire cannot pass a law, you know how they have all the, as soon as you cross the border, they have the liquor stores. They couldn't pass a law saying that people of Massachusetts, had to be 21, but in New Hampshire they only had to be 18 or something like that, right? They can't pass laws that deprive you of a law, of rights in every state. This became a really big issue when gay marriages were being accepted in some states and not in others, that there were plenty of court cases, and it was established that the Constitution meant that any rights that you had in one state would apply in all states. It came up specifically when gay people who were married decided to get divorced. And then there would be a divorce settlement in one state, and gay people were moving to another state that had anti-gay marriage rules, and were saying that the alimony payments didn't have to be paid because they lived in a state that didn't recognize gay marriage. So these were ironed out, and now it has to be accepted in all states. But that was another thing, duties of states, new states and territories, how to bring in new states, a system, right? One of the interesting things, because I usually talk to, people say, you like talking to older people? And I say, yeah, because I'm with people that can, if I say, can you remember where you were when John Kennedy, you heard that John Kennedy was assassinated, you might be able to do that, right? If I teach immigrants, even if they're older, they don't even remember 9/11 because they didn't live here then, and my high school kids weren't alive then, so you don't have this kind of common understanding. But I tell my students about, I remember when we got 2 new states, right?
Yeah.
So in the 20th century, there were 3 new states, Oklahoma in 1907, Arizona and New Mexico in 1912, but I wasn't alive then. My grandparents were, but I wasn't. So Do you remember, if you're old enough, 59 and 60, when Alaska and Hawaii became states? That was like so cool, right? And I only went to Alaska, my wife and I, last year for the first time. So
Good for
did get
you.
cool. All right, we go everywhere at every moment. There are some economic limitations too, and time. But anyway, that was the process that they used. Thank you. The process that they, thank you for coming. The process they used was established in 1787 when they wrote this, how to amend the Constitution, some federal rules, ratification of the Constitution. Now, they have to get 9 states to agree to this. It's a pretty vague document. And a lot of states are going to have to give up their sovereignty, right? And individuals are going to have to give up their sovereignty to a new government. So, there's a demand right away for a Bill of Rights to define individual people's protection against the government. That's what the Bill of Rights does. It protects you from your government, right? There's no other thing, that's what it does. So, for example, the very, controversial Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, right? What's the context? Well, they're writing the Bill of Rights in 1790. They just came from rule by the British. Why was Paul Revere warning those people? Because the British Army is marching from Boston to Lexington to Concord to take away the weapons of the militia. So when you read the Second Amendment, that's what it's in response to, right? This was an essential right. And people had guns, they would shoot the deer. People who had, guns. The Native Americans were an actual and proximate threat. I mean, not if you lived in Boston, but if you lived out in the Berkshires, still a possibility. So these are they're thinking within that kind of context. Now, it's been said that maybe we could now have gun control laws that said the only kind of guns you could have are the type of guns that they had in 1791, right? The one shot, so you're not going to have assault rifles and take out a whole bunch of people at a bar if you have to reload your gun every 30 seconds, kind of thing. That's obviously absurd, but they weren't thinking in terms of assault weapons or anything like that, but that's why that's there. The Third Amendment seems extremely archaic. The housing of soldiers, right? Really? There's a law that's saying that the government can't house soldiers in your house? You think, what? How would that happen? But, of course, that's one of the abuses of the British. Not only are the British sending soldiers to police the colonists to make sure they do what they're told, but at the expense of the colonists, people are required to take in the soldiers that are policing them and feeding them. So they pass a thing, this is within this context, right? And you go right here. Searches and seizures, of course, right? Coming into your house without a warrant, etc. Your rights in the criminal cases, trial by jury. If you don't have the right to an attorney, it'll be, provided for you. Right to attorney at trial, jury of your peers, all that sort of stuff that we sort of take for granted. They're still arguing this. When we listen to the Karen Reed case, every day you hear echoes of the Bill of Rights, right? Right to a fair trial, rights in civil cases, right? So you have criminal cases which can result in being jailed, and you have civil cases which are monetary fines and stuff. So they're defining those kind of things. Bail, fines, punishment, rights not mentioned. So if you read this, it says that any rights that are not prohibited or talked about are reserved to the people. That's what the phrase says. Basically, that means if it's not against the law, you can do it. I mean, essentially, that's what it means, right? They can't make ex post facto laws. You don't do something wrong, and then they make a law and arrest you for having done something which was not against the law at the time that you did it, right? So That's it, against ex post facto laws, laws that they make after you've done this and then they convict you for something that you did last year when it wasn't yet against the law, right? It's important to protect. The British, they feel, are abusing them in that fashion, making things against the law, and you did it last year and they were coming to get you. So that's what that's about. And powers not delegated. This is the states' rights clause, right? If it's not in the Constitution, then it is a state's right. So when I do the citizenship, like give an example of this, right? When you get your driver's license, you don't get it from the federal government, you get it from the state. You get your teacher's license. Why? Well, why is that? Well, none of that's mentioned in the Constitution, right? Driver's licenses, etc. Anything that's not mentioned there, that's why we have health care, state by state. That's why we have education systems, state by state. That's why we have rules about driving, state by state, liquor laws, state by state, etc. None of those things are mentioned in the Constitution. And this was extremely important for the Southern delegates because the primary thing that they wanted to do was protect slavery, right? And to have, their own ways of life. So, powers not, this is the states' rights, and we still fight about states' rights on all sorts of issues. Amongst the abortion question, right, is a state-by-state thing, right? In the attempt by the Supreme Court in Roe to come up with a Solomon-like decision with the three, stages of the pregnancy, that sort of business, the trimesters, that was eliminated by the Dobbs decision unnecessarily, in my opinion. But anyway, this thing, we still fight about states' rights. Now, the amendments to the Constitution. We're running really short on time. But let me point something out. It is, Jefferson said, and he was not, by the way, at the Constitutional Convention. Constitutional Convention is more of a Hamiltonian product, right? It comes from the point of view of power rather than the point of view of humanity. I don't know, whatever. I'm not a Hamilton fan, as you can tell. Anyway, there was that. We didn't see the play except on the television on Disney, the play Hamilton that was so hot and people were paying $1,000 to go see it, And I have this sort of Italian-American comedian that I like, Sebastian Maniscalco, and he's talking about, he and his wife go to see Hamilton. This was a couple of years ago. He and his wife go, they know nothing about history at all, right? But everybody's going, it's a hot thing. So they put down $1,000 a piece and they go in Chicago, where he actually lived. And Washington, he goes, I didn't know Hamilton was black. This kind of stuff. And it was just like, if you're not a fan of Hamilton, and Ron Chernow, who wrote the book that Lin-Manuel Miranda wrote the play from, has just put out a new book on George Washington. So I don't know if I'm going to hack my way through that. But anyway, it was just kind of thing. But in that, Hamilton's the good guy, and Jefferson is not the good guy. And it's like there's this sort of myth that, Hamilton didn't have slaves, right? Well, he didn't. But he was married to Elizabeth Schuyler. The Schuyler family was like amongst the richest families in New York, and a large portion of their fabulous wealth came from the slave trade. So, the devil's in the details sort of thing, right? Yeah. Okay. So, Jefferson is saying the Constitution belongs to the living, not the dead. And it's an important principle that they're able to amend this, to make changes. And it's amendment to contract, right? So if you have your roof done and you want to have different color shingles, you have to amend the contract. And that's what it is. It changes in the contract between the government and its citizens, right? And at first, the first two are done to correct mistakes, right? So in the 11th Amendment, somewhat obscure. It's about which courts have which jurisdictions, right? And I was doing parent-teacher conferences at the school that I was teaching at, and it was a all-boys Catholic school, prep school, and so the people who sent their kids there paid a lot of money and were had big jobs. And so I was just sort of bantering with a parent one day, and I said, yeah. I was talking about what we were doing, the amendments, and I said, yeah, some of the more obscure amendments, like the 11th Amendment. Like a fool, I say that, and the guy's a lawyer. And he knows how important the 11th Amendment is, because it defines which courts hear what cases. And so, egg on my face on that one. But people don't think about the 11th Amendment. It's the first time that there is a Supreme Court case in 1795 called Chisholm versus Georgia. And the Supreme Court sides with Chisholm, a person who had lent money to Georgia during the Revolution and needs to outfit the Georgia militia. And he's not getting his money, so he wants to sue Georgia to get his money. So the Supreme Court decides that it's going to hear the case, right? And they side with Chisholm against Georgia. Well, the states are mad as hatters. They're saying that the states are saying that a case like that should be held in state courts. But in the original Constitution, it defines it as being, if it's a citizen of one state against another state, it would be held in a federal court. Okay, right? So how do you change that? The states very quickly, it's the first time they amend, and they very quickly pass a law to change it. That suits against states will be held in state courts. Okay, it's just a quick thing. And it was like, that's how they thought of it. You pass the amendments to change a mistake. All right. Second, the 12th Amendment, right? This is the coolest one. Presidential elections. I just love this one. So I'm running out of time, but I gotta get this in here. Right? In the original Constitution, they do not take into account the possibilities that there's going to be political parties. Right?
Pretty wild.
Washington, for example, is talking about, oh, that's really bad, factionalism and all this. No political parties. But almost immediately, you have the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans, right? So Hamilton and Adams, who don't like each other, but they're one side, and Jefferson and Madison on the other side, right? These are different views of how the country should be run, centralized power or diffused power, okay. But the original Constitution says you have a vote, and there was a very limited franchise. Originally, each state, by the way, there's nothing about voting in the Constitution. The word voting does not come up in the Constitution until blah, blah, blah. The 15th Amendment gives the right to vote to people of color, right? So it is a state's right. Since it's not mentioned in the Constitution, each state can make their own rules for voting, right? So pretty quickly they settle on 21-year-old males, right? Each state adopts that. But there are property qualifications, right? You have to pay a certain amount of property tax to be eligible to vote. And initially it was quite high. It doesn't really come down until Jacksonian democracy, when property qualifications are pretty much eliminated to, of course, increase the mass of working class voters for Jackson's policies, right? But so, all right, so people vote, and then they elect electors, state by state, to vote for the president. But the original Constitution says the person with the most electoral votes becomes president, and the person with the second most electoral votes becomes vice president. Immediately you can see the problem by just applying it to things. So Trump is president and Hillary Clinton is vice president? Trump is president, I mean, that's what it said. So Washington wins the first two without any opposition. But then in 1796, you have another election. Jefferson against Adams, right? Adams wins. Jefferson gets the second most votes. Adams is the president, and Jefferson is the vice president. What? I mean, you know what I mean? This is exactly like Trump and Hillary Clinton, right? It's not gonna, it's not gonna work. So they realized the flaw because in 1800, all of the Federalist electors vote for Adams for president and C.C. Pinckney, I think, of South Carolina, as vice president. All of the Democratic Republican electors, and they're a majority, vote for and originally each elector had 2 votes. Now they had 1, they had 2 votes. So you cast 1 for president and 1 for vice president, right? All of the Federalist electors vote for, split their votes, every one, split their votes between Jefferson and Aaron Burr,
Oh,
right? Now you have a tie for president. Who's the president? Now, if, and it's still true today, if there's no majority for president, then it goes to the House of Representatives, right? So, Jefferson or Burr, they go to the House of Representatives, right? And this has happened other times in history, but they go to the House of Representatives, and the Federalists, right, have enough votes. They haven't changed office yet, so the Federalists have enough votes to actually pick who they want. 2 of their enemies, one of them has to be president, right? And famously, Alexander Hamilton, who hated Aaron Burr, and Aaron Burr hated Alexander Hamilton. People are coming to Hamilton, who is not in the House of Representatives, and asking him, what do you think for? And he tells them that Jefferson is less dangerous than Burr, and that they should vote for Jefferson, right? But, so, Jefferson becomes the president, and Aaron Burr becomes the vice president by decision of the House of, well, this is a bad idea. And you know, of course, that Hamilton and Burr have the duel, and Hamilton kills Burr. I think that's in the play, probably. Can't remember. I was upset by that point toward the end. But anyway, so that's clearly a mistake. So they hop right to it, and they pass a constitutional amendment, creating the system that we have now, right? That you have 1 elector, and you pick somebody to be your running mate. So you know who the vice president's going to be if this person becomes president. That's 2 really quick ones to change flaws. So you might think, oh, this works great. But if you look, the next constitutional amendment, this is 1804 to 1865. It's a huge period of time before there's any other constitutional amendment. And there's 3 in a row, right? 13, 14, 15. And those are the 3 constitutional amendments that arise in response to the result of the Civil War. The freeing of the slaves. But of course, okay, now you're free, now what? And then the giving of civil rights and citizenship rights to the former slaves. All right? And so,
thank you.
oh, thank you for coming. I am getting near the end here. For those of you that are itching to get out, it's like my class. Oh, let's go early. I used to be a real hard ass about that, but now teaching like the night school, it's people go home to their children. I worked all day, and if they want to leave at 10 minutes to 9, okay, see you. Rather than that. But anyway, right? So you get the three civil rights amendments, right? Including the right that's in dispute now, the 14th Amendment, right to citizenship.
Can I just, maybe you meant constitutional amendments, how does that work?
Okay,
You
has
mentioned
to
it a bunch of
have
times.
2/3 of both houses of Congress,
2/3, yeah.
and then it goes out to the states, 3/4 of the state legislators. So, is that easy or is that hard? Sometimes it's really easy. 2 amendments that I can think of that passed in just a couple of months was the 26th and 27th Amendments. Both of them really passed very, very quickly. 26th Amendment gave the 18-year-old the right to vote in 1971, and that was old enough, that was the war in Vietnam,
Yeah.
old enough to die, old enough to vote. It was hard to be against that. The 27th Amendment is about congressional pay raises. Basically, it says that you know, who sets congressional pay? Well, they do, right? So they can vote themselves anything. So you could vote yourself a pay raise, but the 27th Amendment says you can't take the pay raise that you voted for yourself until you've been reelected. So your opponent can tell your people that this bum just gave himself a $20,000 pay raise, and he isn't. He's a bum, and he is. And we're going to vote against him. Vote for me. I'm not for pay raises. Whatever. It's interesting to note that the original Bill of Rights, written by James Madison, had 12 amendments, but only 10 passed the state legislatures. 2 of them didn't pass. One of them was the one that I just said, which would have been the Second Amendment. It doesn't get passed until 1992, when a college student, this is a true story, doesn't sound true, a college student at Texas Tech is doing a paper as a junior, and writing a paper about constitutional amendments. And he discovers that most constitutional amendments, almost all of them, have what's called the sunset date. If you don't pass it 3/4 of the state by a certain date, then it goes into abeyance and you have to start over again, right? But there was no sunset date, so he has it reintroduced to Congress in 1992, and it passes very quickly, because who could be against that? But it didn't pass the states in 1791. And the First Amendment, which would have been the First Amendment, was about, Madison wanted a mathematical system for increasing the number of members of the House of Representatives as the population of the country went up, right? Right now, citizenship test, 435 members in the House of Representatives, right? That's been the case since 1920. The population of the United States in 1920, 115 million people. Right now it's 341 million people. Same amount of House of Representatives. In the first Congress, 1 rep for every 30,000 inhabitants per congressional district. Now about nearly 800,000 people that Steve Lynch, for example, represents. Nearly 800,000 people. How much representation do you get? You know, he does have fairly decent district offices, so if you're having trouble getting your mother into the country for a visa, you can go see them, and they are pretty responsive, but the fact is, that is not what they envisioned in the beginning. But it's been thwarted. It's changed. The number would have to be changed. Since it's not in the Constitution, it would have to be changed by Congress, and in 1930, there was a move to try to increase it because there was huge immigration that had come into the country, and they tried to extend it, and most of the immigrants who were coming into the country in the early part of the 20th century were moving to the cities, which was the base of the Democrats. So the Republicans, since you have to have 2/3 of both houses and 3/4 of the state legislatures, the Republicans have been able to block expansion, right? Expansion of the thing. So there are proposals in Congress right now, what's called the Wyoming Act, and it's because Wyoming has the fewest amount of people, 610,000 people in Wyoming, and that the law should say, the new proposal, which will never pass, that the congressional districts, their base number should be the number of the state with the least amount of people. So that would reduce, it would reduce the amount of people Steve Lynch was representing from 790-some thousand to 610,000 people, and that would increase the number of representatives, right? Anyway, that would have been in the First Amendment that was defeated. States did not want the federal government dictating these numbers or something. I don't really know that much about that. So then you look at these things. After the blacks have the right to vote in 1870, then you have another long period, then you have the Progressive Era amendments, right? This is, think of Progressive Era, Teddy Roosevelt, let's change the country, let's modernize it, right? It's a new country now, not the old West country. So you see there, the federal income tax. The original Constitution very specifically outlaws a tax on individuals. You can tax states, right? The federal government can require a certain amount of tax income to cover expenditure from the states. But the individual income tax, and you can see that was battled, you know, the country in the beginning and always run by people who have more money, not the people that don't have money, right? They might be able to slip a few reps in, but generally, the rich people run the country, right? So this idea of a direct income tax on all income is fiercely opposed forever, but, you know, like Roosevelt gets the ball started. You have this period of progressive era. After this direct election of senators, they used to be, until then, elected by state legislatures, right? As Mark Twain said, the finest Senate money can buy, right? So there were maybe 40 legislators in the New Hampshire legislature at the time this was there. You could buy them all. 40 guys, rich guys could buy 40 guys. So now we have direct election senators, prohibition of liquor. Right? As we know, it doesn't work out very well, and they repeal it. The only case of a repealing of a thing, but it was seen as a progressive thing, right? Women who are now getting the vote are opposed to this. The alcoholism, like if you read about it, is extraordinary. Men are paid partially out in the factories with a jug of liquor. Men, you know, famously go to the bar before they come home from the factory. There's massive amount of domestic abuse, which is not against the law at that time. And so the women's movement is not only for suffrage, but for temperance. And it passes. Same sort of groupings that want to improve the society. The biggest argument for women's suffrage, the most effective one, was that if you allow women to vote, since women are more moral, the country will be improved morally, right? You got to remember, any votes for women has to be passed by men. They're the only ones that can vote. They vote to give women the right to vote. You got to give them a reason. What's the good reason? Not just that your wife is henpecking you. There has to be this larger argument that the society will be improved by bringing more moral voters into the voting group, right? You know, I think it's pretty, I think you can argue pretty effectively that that's not actually true, but that was, in case you're wondering, what is the motivation there, right? So the women to vote, the terms, and then the terms of the president and Congress. Not only was it changed the date of the inauguration, but also when does Congress meet? Right? So the president is inaugurated today on January 20th, but Congress meets on January 3rd to get right to work, sort of thing, after the Christmas holidays. No, that's the idea. Instead of the lame duck period where they weren't going to meet until March 4th. And, you know, when you read about the Great Depression, it's just like, read some. The best book I can tell, and you probably won't remember this, Robert McIlvaine. It was written in 1984. It's called The Great Depression. Robert McIlvaine. It was a New York Times book. I read it in a course called America from Reagan, no, from something to Reagan. I can't remember. Anyway, but it was a book about the later 20th century in America. So anyway, presidential limited to 2 terms, right? In 1951, Roosevelt had had the 4 terms. The Republicans get back the House of Representatives for the first time since 1930, actually 1928. Was 1929 when they came back. It was the last time they had it, and this is when Joe Martin, you know, there's the Joe Martin Center over at, he was the Speaker of the House then, and in revenge, posthumous revenge against Franklin Roosevelt, they passed this, right? It didn't apply. I was watching High School Quiz Show on Channel 2 the other night, and they asked the kids who was, once they passed the 2-term amendment, which president did it apply to? And one of the smart kids said Harry Truman. He was the president at that time, but it actually didn't. They grandfathered him in. He could have run for another term, although he was so unpopular with the Korean War going bad that Eisenhower won. Eisenhower was the first president that had the 2-term limitation, right? And then you have kind of the amendments that are reformist in the 1960s, the group, right? You have voting in Washington, 1961. People of Washington, D.C. could not vote for president until 1961, even though the president lived down the street. People in Washington, D.C. have no representation to this day in the Congress of the United States. None. They don't even have a representative, one. They have the requisite number 1 to the House of Representatives. They do not have that. The rule is the D.C. is run by the Congress of the United States, right? So, and the president, right? So, I mean, why weren't troops called out to protect the Capitol on the day of the counting in, the Trump sort of dispute? Why not? Only the Capitol Police were there, a small thin blue line against them, because the people that had the authority to call out the troops were not interested in doing so. Oh yes, supposedly Trump said that Pelosi could have called out the troops. Not true. Right, and of course there's the great, no, the mayor did not have, the mayor could have called out the city police, right, which didn't seem to be a particularly good idea. If the city police all flock down there, there's going to be chaos in the city. So she's not, doesn't have the thing to call out the National Guard. It's not like Maura Healey could call them to protect the National Guard of Massachusetts, to protect the State House, right? Not like that. There was nothing. Trump would have had to call it out, and he didn't have any interest in doing that. It's really extraordinary that happened. And then, of course, all those people were freed, right? There is a little precedent for that. On January 5th, 1865, the finally enough states ratified the 13th Amendment, and the black people were freed. Not on Juneteenth, on December 5th. On December 25th, Lincoln was killed in April. On December 25th, 20 days later, Andrew Johnson gives a blanket pardon to all of the Confederates, the people in revolt, that they cannot be prosecuted for that. Not a single member of the Confederate leadership is ever prosecuted for a crime except for the man that ran the Andersonville prison, right, the human rights violations against the human. But that was not because he was in uprising. So there is a precedent for this, right? No one is prosecuted, even the leaders of the Confederates, for all the damage that their revolution did, And anyway, there's the voting in Washington, end to the poll taxes.
Mm-hmm.
One of the ways to suppress black voting was to charge a fee for voting, along with the literacy tests, which were eliminated by congressional action, right? And so, enter the poll taxes, presidential disability and succession, in response to John Kennedy, right, and Johnson. Johnson is the last president to not have a vice president. There were plenty of presidents who died in office, either assassinated or died, from illnesses. None of them ever had a vice president replaced. But they decide at this point in 1967, to set up a better system for replacing the president, defining the new president's powers, appointing a new vice president, right? And then you had that wonderful scenario that you probably do remember, right? Nixon leaves, Ford becomes, oh, right, well, no, Agnew leaves, right? Then Ford is made vice president, then Nixon leaves, Ford is the president, then he picks Nelson Rockefeller to come be the vice president. Nelson Rockefeller is one of the 4 Republicans in my entire life that I voted for. I grew up in New York, and when I first voted, he was governor of New York. That was in the days when there were progressive Republicans, like Teddy Roosevelt. Don't knock the rock. they used to say. All right, and then, so the disability and succession, there's also that business that says in there that Congress can make a judgment about the president's incapacities. There was a talk about that when Reagan was clearly, by 87, showing distinct signs of Alzheimer's. And there was some talk about doing this because there was talk by the Republicans of trying to change the Constitution so that Reagan could have run for a third term. Is this the sign? Okay. Anyway, it is 3:35, and we should free the people. Thank you. Last time I had the little cards about things that people might be interested in doing, and I would say if I do this again, next time would be October, in case you're asking.